Thank you for coming. You might have come for the pizza. Thank you for staying for the talk. I don't take that personally. I'm Sicilian. That both is, part of what makes me preternaturally undisposed toward pacifism, but also very amenable to, if you came for the pizza, that's okay. All right. We're good on sound? Sound check in the back? Yeah? Excellent. All right. Everything that follows in this talk will follow from the fact, and I take it as a fact, we could dispute it if we need, that the Christian ethical life has as its central commitment the dominical command to love. Love your neighbor, love your enemies. This love command is not an option, it's an absolute mandate. But because of the conditions of this world and of the conditions of the human soul, it's not always clear precisely how we are to love. For instance, how do we love one neighbor when he is unjustly kicking in the face of another neighbor and will not stop? It doesn't matter if the first neighbor, let's call him the enemy neighbor, refuses to stop his kicking and our victim neighbor is unable to defend himself. We're not let off the hook. We're still called to love them both. Nor is it sufficient to say something like, well, I'm going to love the victim neighbor now, and then afterwards, when the smoke is cleared, I'm going to love the enemy neighbor. That's not sufficient. We're supposed to love both of them in this moment at the same time. This is clear to me. But it's also clear that I cannot love both of them in this exact moment in exactly the same way. But I am to love them. So how do we do that? So this talk is oriented around trying to answer that question and in also engaging the question of what kind of person is actually capable of loving in this way. So C.S. Lewis, if you didn't come for the pizza, you probably came for C.S. Lewis. I don't hold that against you either. That's a good thing. C.S. Lewis, standing in what I'll call the I don't call it, other people call it, I agree with it, standing in an Augustinian stream of Christian realism, offers guidance flowing out of the Greco-Roman and Hebraic patrimony, the inheritance on which places like Liberty is built, and how this patrimony has fortified Christian intelligence regarding the use of force since the beginning of the church. Now, Lewis provides guidance in how we are to love in conflict situations, both our enemy neighbor as well as our innocent neighbor. And some of this shouldn't be too terribly difficult, I think, to conceive. The idea that force, even lethal force, deployed for the rescue of the victim neighbor, how that can be consistent with, or even expression of love for that neighbor, for the innocent neighbor, is probably self-evident. But how such force can also be consistent with, or even an expression of love for the enemy neighbor from whom we are rescuing him, is perhaps a bit less clear. The question is this: can we really love our enemies to death? So, let us travel to Narnia. You should remember the scene. In the dead of night, young Caspian, future king of Narnia, stands with his tutor Cornelius atop the central tower in the great castle at the center of the realm. They've come to witness the conjunction of two noble planets, Tarva, the Lord of Victory, and Alambil, the Lady of Peace. Now, such a meeting, the tutor Cornelius instructs his pupil, has not happened for 200 years, and it portends fortune, good fortune, for the sad land. This fortune, we soon learn, is going to be manifest when Caspian comes into his birthright to command an insurrection of dwarves and talking beasts in the great war of deliverance that liberates Narnia from the usurping grip of his evil uncle Miraz. All right. By some accounts, we've already gone too far. The storyline is broken, some will insist, at the outset. The Narnian Chronicles, insists one critic, is, quote, one of the most ugly and poisonous things I have ever read. It is a sadomasochistic relish for violence, and it permeates the whole cycle, end quote. So asserts the author of his Dark Materials trilogy, Philip Pullman. Now, he's not entirely alone. There's another pair of literary critics who charged that among the Narnian books' offenses are the glorification of conflict and retribution and the legitimizing of cruelty. Now, such critics might have had Prince Caspian particularly in mind. In this second book in the Chronicles, and maybe this is a caveat, it is the second book in the Chronicles, right? You're a younger generation, you grew up with like the the chronological order or something. We could disagree about enemy love, but we're not going to disagree. It's the second book. I've got a nod over there. Do I have an amen? Amen. All right. Stick a fork in you. You're done. This is great. In the second book of the Chronicles, to be sure, we find things like blood, battle, betrayal, maiming, death. All these things feature frequently. And indeed, the High King Peter, you'll remember, who's just a schoolboy, is described in one instance as having felled an enemy by slashing his legs out from under him, and then with a back cut of the same stroke, walloping off his head, right? It's there. It's grim, to be sure. But to Pullman, it's also an indictment. Pullman says this: the highest virtue, we have this on the authority of the New Testament itself, is love. And yet you find not a trace of love in the Narnian books. So heartened, as I'm sure that C.S. Lewis would be by his atheist critics pontificating on the character of the Christian Bible, he would probably have to disagree regarding Pullman's analysis. For Lewis, of course, the Narnian stories are all about love. It's not love despite the battles and despite the wars, but it's love that, because it is love, reveals itself in the rescue of the innocent, the defense of justice, and the punishment of evil, even if, in the last resort, by war. And most crucially, love is displayed in the character of the warriors who wage those wars. So to expound on this, let us travel to another place. I'm going to dim the lights briefly. All right. In room 58 of the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery in London resides the under-celebrated Venus and Mars by Renaissance master Sandro Botticelli. The painting portrays the post-coital deities. Can I say post-coital at liberty? Is that okay? I'm getting some nods. Okay. Sorry if I can't. The painting displays the post-coital deities reclining opposite one another in a little wood, and they're surrounded by a small fold of rather frolicsome satyrs. You can see this, the fawns. If you look at any number of commentaries on the painting, including, unfortunately, on the National Gallery's own website, you'll note that the work is typically taken to symbolize the platitude that love conquers war. And admittedly, the immediate presentation of the painting seems to bear this out. Venus, the goddess of love, is clothed and awake. She's watching Mars, the war god. Now Mars, and I think I can forward on this a little bit. Nope, not yet. Mars, the war god, is naked and very much asleep. He's been both unarmed and unarmored. Now on the surface, Mars seems overthrown. Now, however, initial appearances aside, I think prolonged consideration makes the interpretation unsatisfying. And I think our suspicions that this is unsatisfying deepens when we learn that a facsimile of this Botticelli masterwork hung in C.S. Lewis's Oxford rooms at Magdalen College. Now, Lewis, if you don't know, is self-confessedly, or was maybe still is, self-confessedly unenthusiastic about paintings in general. In some letters that he wrote to a personal friend, he says he was walking around the National Gallery. He discovered in himself a distaste for most of the paintings, except two, and one of them was Sandro Botticelli's Venus and Mars. If you know, both his office and his home have been described as being basically unadorned. He had very little artwork on his walls. So it seems to me that given those two things, it can scarcely be believed that Lewis, who's unlikely to overlook simplistic aphorisms in the first place, would include among the few paintings for which he did care, a painting who bears so saccharine a theme as love conquers war. Now, how do we explain this then? I think there can be found in the Lewisian corpus two promising explanatory keys, and I think they're particularly pertinent. Now, the first is found in a letter that C.S. Lewis wrote in the late autumn of 1925 to a historian friend. And in it he says this. He says, in a certain juncture of the planets, so at certain times when planets come together, in a certain juncture of the planets, Lewis mused, each planet may play the other planet's part. All right? When planets come together, each may play the other's part. Turning back to the Botticelli, I think this suggestion has some purchase. Mars has lost some of the martial aspect. He's been dispossessed of his armor and his lance. You can see down there, the little fawn is inside his breastplates. He's been euphemistically unmanned. He is defenseless as he slumbers almost fully exposed, save for a little strip of flesh or a little strip of cloth that covers him up. In contrast to Mars, Venus appears to have taken up the martial character. She may not be merely watching Mars, but watching over him as well. Where's this? Oh, I guess that's all I have. All right, here. Watching over Mars as well. She's acquired, in a certain view, her lover's helm and lance. You can see how they've been repositioned as if she's wielding them. Truly, each does seem to have played, or is now playing, the other's part. But I would argue that importantly, this reversal is incomplete. Venus is still Venus. This is evidenced not simply by the fact that she has loved her lover into a coma, but by her own continued physical beauty, a beauty which is eroticized by her diaphanous gown, the sort of see-through gown that she has. One can see the folds of this garment just beginning to be pulled beneath her fingers up her leg. All right, you can kind of see in there. It's probably not close enough, but if you got closer, you would see that the folds are gathering under her finger. All right, precisely what Venus has in mind is speculative, of course, but it might be suggested by the satyr who is about to blow a conch shell in Mars's ear. The fact of the garment drawing up her leg and Mars' imminent rousing, not to say arousal, are surely connected. So, first appearance aside, perhaps, the painting is incredibly dynamic. Motion is erupting everywhere. It's a chaotic little scene. Now, Mars, for his part, is recognizably still the war god. He's still well-muscled. My 16-year-old son disputes this, but he's got to understand in the Renaissance context this was a well-muscled man. His strength remains latent. Indeed, in his very nakedness, which at one level, and especially to us, might suggest vulnerability, was in the Renaissance imagination a sign that he was in total control even when vulnerable. Mars is so confident with who he is that he can lie naked and not be afraid. All right, he's comfortable with this. So it points out not vulnerability necessarily, but power under control in the Renaissance mind. It's worth pointing out that the blowing of the conch shell itself plays into this idea. So the ancient Romans believed that the peaceful dormancy of the god of war could be interrupted by ritual incantation. So as Roman warriors enter the battlefield, their warlord would shout, "Mars Vigilia," which means Mars awaken. And once roused, the war god would then lead the Romans to victory. All right, so you see this motif, I think, arguably being played out. So, to account for Venus and Mars's resilient self-possession, we turn to the second explanatory key in Lewis. In a critical analysis of Spencer's Fairy Queen, Lewis describes how Renaissance depictions of inverted relationships in images of cosmic order, all right, so this, images of cosmic order, two planets coming together, inverting their relationships, each taking the other's part, how this is meant to convey not a triumph of one or the other, but rather to convey mutual reconciliation. So this is not conquest, this is conjunction. It's not love overcoming war, it's love and war coming together in conjunction. I think this is precisely what's happening in the Botticelli. The hypothesis has legs. Consider this. What is the name, here's a test, of Venus's and Mars's most noteworthy offspring? Who comes of this joining? What is their daughter's name? Anybody? The name is Concordia. Concordia was the personification of harmony, of unity, of accord, of peace. So Venus and Mars, love and war, as depicted in this painting, both embrace and reform one another in mutual self-giving without either annihilating the other one. And the result is peace. So this, I think, is an idea with which Lewis could truck. All right. Such an idea also alerts us to what Lewis might have been up to on that central tower in Narnia. So let's return there. While it's popularly assumed that this conjunction of planets that they're watching, Tarva and Alambil, signify the Narnian versions of Mars and Venus, this is apparently not the case. So in a book called Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, which I commend to you, the author Michael Ward points out that on several occasions we are told that the Narnian morning star is not Venus, or in this context is not Alambil, but Erever. So instead, Ward posits the conjunction of these two planets that Caspian comes to observe is actually two aspects of the martial influence, the Martian influence. Mars is not only a fighting machine, Ward reminds us. Mars has always had a more pacific, life-giving dimension as well. So this is to say that Mars originally, in the Roman mindset, was a springtime god of vegetation and fertility. So under the name Mars Silvanus, his functions were rustic. He dwelled in forests and mountains, and he cared for cattle, right? So a scene not unlike the Botticelli. Now his warrior dimensions, Mars Gradavis, came later, eventually superseding this less belligerent role. But this double nature is paralleled, I think, both in the Botticelli by the presence of arms and armor as well as woodland satyrs and his lover's sort of arboreal nest, and in the architecture of the Narnian tower on which Caspian stands. So they climb this tower to observe this conjunction of two planets, which might both symbolize dual aspects of the martial influence. And the castle itself is described as having on one side battlements, so crenellations from which you could shoot arrows, and on the other unembattled sides, without crenellations, you had a view of the castle gardens. So just in the tower itself, you have both this military aspect and this arboreal or sylvan aspect. So Tolkien, I think, does similar things, where he marbles together images of gardens and battles throughout the Lord of the Rings. Now, in any case, whether through the influence of Venus or the two aspects of his own internal character, Lewis's Mars and the martial character that he influences in others is about much more than war, much more than just violence. So for Lewis, the fullness of this complex martial character is best communicated by the chivalric idea of the knight. And the knight, of course, is the Christian in arms for the defense of a good cause, which Lewis called one of the great Christian ideas. This chivalric ideal, in turn, is best understood through those words addressed to the dead Lancelot, which Lewis calls our attention to. Remember, he reminds us, that in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, Lancelot was described as the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and the sternest knight to thy mortal foe. Lewis expounds on this. He writes, the important thing about the ideal is the double demand it makes on human nature. The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and the ragged stumps of lopped off limbs. He is also a demure, almost maiden-like guest in hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He's not a compromise. He's not a happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth, and he is meek to the nth. Now in this, Lewis is thoroughly Augustinian. Among much else, the Augustinian realist does not judge the martial nature, that's to say the belligerent dimension of human being, as something that has to necessarily be overcome. He recognizes instead that given the conditions of this world, martial power, including coercive justice, is a basic, even salutary property of political life. It's a good thing. However, because human beings are motivated both by love as well as selfishness and cruelty, the use of force must be viewed with skepticism, and it must be deployed within carefully prescribed constraints. So this recognition is exemplified in the Christian moral framework known as the just war tradition, which states that wars may be justly fought only when a sovereign authority, over whom there is no one greater charged with the care of the political community, determines in the last resort, and with the aim of peace, that discriminate and proportionate force is necessary to retribute a sufficiently grave evil, to take back what has been wrongly taken, or to protect the innocent. In such cases, and only in such cases, war may be required to restore order, justice, and thereby, hopefully, peace and conciliation. And these are not trifles. These are political goods without which no other political good can long endure. This, then, is the salient connection. In both Botticelli and Lewis, we see the pacific, life-giving functions of Mars share the same project as his martial function. In the Christian life, this is exemplified in the fact that love qualifies but does not eradicate war. This points, as another Narnian friend, Gene Elstein, once insisted, this points to the existence or possible existence of a certain kind of self, one that is motivated or one that is strong enough to resist the lure of seductive, violent enthusiasms, and one that is bounded by and laced through with a sense of responsibility and accountability. This is to say, chivalry was always something more than mere literary artifact. Now, writing at the beginning of the Second World War, Lewis found the chivalric ideal to be terribly relevant. It may or may not be practicable, he wrote. The Middle Ages notoriously failed to obey it. But it is certainly practical. Practical, Lewis insisted, as the fact that men in a desert must find water or die. The key was in remembering that the knight is a work not of nature, but of art. Of that art, Lewis writes, which has human beings instead of canvas or marble for its medium. Chivalry attempted to bring together two things that since the fall of humanity have no natural tendency to gravitate toward one another. It teaches humility and forbearance to the great warrior because everybody knew by experience how much he usually needed the lesson, and it demands, as Lewis wrote, valor of the urbane and modest man because everybody knew as likely as not that he was going to be a milksop, all right, spineless. The danger, as Lewis saw it, was that if we cannot produce Lancelots, then humanity falls into either of two sections. Those who can deal in blood and iron, but know nothing about mercy, and who kill men as they cry for quarter, and those who are meek in hall, but useless in battle. That's the hopeless choice, either an implacable Achilles, who at his worst captured and killed helpless men at his leisure, or Caspar Milquetoast, which this probably dates myself, but he was an H.T. Webster cartoon kind of anti-hero who stood up to nothing, right? He was a jellyfish. Against both Achilles and Milquetoast, Lewis gives us such figures as Reepicheep, the high mouse of Narnia, arguably the most courageous, most devout follower of Aslan in all of the Narnian tales. And this is T-A-L-E-S, not T-A-I-L-E-S, but that's relevant too. So it's Reepicheep who most plainly displays this marbling of ferocity and meekness that Lewis calls for in the knights. Reep, you'll remember, constantly champions the courageous defense of the innocent. And yet he's the one who's most eager to travel to Aslan's country, where he will no longer need to bear arms. And so you recall, I think in the second to last book, I guess, where just before he sails into the utter east, he bids farewell to Edmund and Lucy, and he gives up his sword in a most Arthurian of ways. He throws it across the water where it spins and lands hilltop, right? This should be reminiscent of Excalibur and all of that. It's the only time he ever dispensed with his weapon, and it was the one moment where he knew that he, or better, others, would no longer need his sword. That's the only time he gives it up, when it's no longer necessary. One imagines Reep, therefore, in Aslan's country, maybe with a plowshare tending a garden or making cheese or doing something artisanal. All right. I've said the word meek a couple of times. I think it's time for a philological refresher. So Lewis applauds Mallory's description of Lancelot as meek, but this might sound strange to modern ears. I think the term meek is kind of out of favor nowadays. Meek sounds weak, right? Meek is weak. Hardly a quality worth cultivating. I hope every Liberty student knows this. Jesus, of course, paints a similarly perplexing image when he assures us in the Sermon on the Mount that the meek are especially blessed. They will inherit the earth. But modern misunderstandings notwithstanding, there is nothing weak or spineless about the term meek. And indeed, the sense from which both the chivalric and the inscripturated ideal draws their meaning is from the term proas, which is a word used, if indirectly, in ancient sources such as Xenophon and Aristotle to describe instances of power under submission. So not the absence of power, but power under control. One analogy that Aristotle uses, or Xenophon uses, is as a war horse trained for battle. So the emphasis is on power disciplined, ferocity under restraint. There was nothing weak about war horses. They could propel their 2,000 pounds up to 35 miles an hour, and their job was to smash into enemy formations and scatter them, right? They could kick, they could bite, all at the command of their rider, all right? They could do all sorts of things at the command of the one who held their reins. So in this sense, meek is the best summary word for the way in which love qualifies but does not abolish the martial spirit in its lethal expression. In Aristotle, the philosopher casts meekness as a mean between irascibility, which is wild quick-temperedness, and a spineless lack of spirit or cowardice. In fact, Reap arguably matures into meekness over the course of the Narnian stories. He starts off rather bumptious, immoderately courageous, even reckless, you'll recall. But later he shocks everybody in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which I think is the best in the Narnian books. We can argue about that too later. He shocks everyone in the voyage when he prudently suggests that the Narnians stand down rather than attack the Dufflepuds and try and rescue Lucy, right? And so that's a prudent restraint from a duty they might have. And we could talk about how that symbolizes the just war character, but this is meekness. This is power under restraint. All right, but even with this important idea in hand, the question remains, why does love not simply abolish the martial spirit? How can love and war actually, really be compatible, especially with broken and rebellious human beings? As I projected earlier, while it might be obvious how war can be waged out of love in defense of one's threatened neighbors, it remains that the one who is doing the threatening is a neighbor as well, and we have to ask, how can we both love our enemy neighbor and kill him? Now, in The Problem of Pain, Lewis avers that when people think about love, they very often confuse it with kindness, with the desire to see others happy. Not happy in this way or that way, but just happy. Lewis insists, contrary to this, love is something more stern and splendid than mere kindness. There is kindness in love, but love and kindness are not coterminous. And when kindness, in the sense given above, is separated from the other elements of love, it involves a certain fundamental indifference to its object, and even something like contempt for it. The end of that quote. If these are harsh notions, they're also reasonable. So let's go back over our consideration of meekness. It's particularly significant that meek should appear in the Sermon on the Mount. Meek, you'll recall, is listed among the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are presented in a cumulative character description. So all these different constituent elements roll one into the other. The poor in spirit, the meek, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, and the peacemakers. All these characteristics roll together, gathering one into the other, until they form a comprehensive aggregate that Scripture calls a Son of God. So blessed are the peacemakers, goes the final beatitude, for they will be called sons of God. Now this is really saying something. In Semitic thought, sonship is used figuratively to signify the idea that a person shares the qualities, shares the nature of the fatherly figure being specified. So peacemakers look like God. Peacemakers carry the characteristics of God. You'll further recall that the possession of each beatitudinal characteristic is confirmed to be a blessing. Blessed are the poor, the meek, the peacemakers, all of that. The term blessing in Christ's handling also requires some nuance. Now in the Vulgate, the Latin term for blessed can also be translated happiness. But as with Lewis's rendering of kindness and happiness, the beatitudinal kind of happiness does not point to simply a gassy, subjective kind of feeling, but rather it's a concrete, objective fact. Happiness has a peripatetic, an Aristotelian connotation. It points to the enjoyment of those conditions that alone allow human beings made in the image of God to flourish, which is a synonym for happiness, to be that for which they were made. So in the Aristotelian mind, in the Hebraic mind, one can only be happy, one can only flourish if they become that for which they were made. All right, this requires a specific ecosystem that has been built both for body and soul. So Jesus and Lewis want us to be happy, but both are pointing to a non-negotiable set of terms and conditions that will allow happiness to happen. Wonderful is the life or the occasion in which both of these, the objective fact and the subjective feeling, align, but they don't always. And that's okay in a sense, because as an earlier beatitude assures us, in the kingdom's ecology, even those who mourn can be happy. Right? And that only makes sense if we're oriented towards some sort of, ends of what it means to be a human being. All right, so with happiness's objective end in view, we can extend its contrast with mere kindness. Kindness, Lewis warns us, does not concern itself so much with whether its object becomes good or bad, only that it escapes suffering. But love, as Lewis asserts, would rather see its object, quote, suffer much than be happy in contemptible and estranging modes, end quote. The warfighter, like the surgeon, knows that on occasion a hard thing has to be done to prevent the advent of an even harder thing. The surgeon also knows, as at least a just warrior also to know, that the hard thing is not sometimes simply necessary, but very often morally right, therefore morally obligatory. It is clear to medical professionals that they are not performing lesser evils, but rather the greatest possible good. This should also be equally clear to just warriors. Now, all of this, of course, risks sounding a bit too glib. While the doctor can know with certainty that the festering gangrene leg needs to be removed in order to heal the patient, and therefore the harm that they do in carving the patient is justified. To know without doubt that we're in the right on a battlefield is a claim to omniscience that we don't possess. And this is significant, for at the end of the day, with soldiering, unlike medicine, we may not simply have a hobbled patient whose life we saved by carving them, but we might have a corpse. And the justifiability of making our neighbor into a corpse has to be proved. While the art of political judgment is a bit too complicated to address fully here, there are two things that I want to say. First, to be sure, even without omniscience, there are times where it is quite clear where evil resides and that it ought to be stopped. In the grimly titled Encyclopedia of Genocide, and you thought my book titles were grim, we find summarized the monstrous fate of civilian non-combatants when they became the intentional target of state regimes in the last century alone. In total, the book starts, during the first 88 years of the past century, almost 170 million men, women, and children were shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, crushed, or worked to death, buried alive, drowned, hanged, bombed, or killed in any of the myriad other ways that governments have inflicted death on unarmed, helpless citizens and foreigners. Depending on whether one uses a high or more conservative estimate, the dead could conceivably be more than 360 million people. End of quote. So in most cases, there isn't anything terribly sophisticated in judging acts of political evil. In standing effectively against such evils, love, I think, is obviously consistent with the idea that A deserves B for doing C. Second, while the moral warrior cannot claim omniscience, he can utilize prudence. Acting in the world requires the wisdom that one has, aided by reason, experience, and authority, and in then doing the best one knows with the limited information they have, and typically in a time crunch. This is what the just war moral framework is all about. It takes moral rules, it couples them with context, and it promotes the best responsive action that it can. Of course, not to act is also a decision requiring some degree of justification. We can't forget that. The just war moral framework harnesses reason because reason is necessary, not merely intuitions. Intuitions can run astray more easily, arguably, than reason. One intuition, Lewis observed, that is prevalent in the West, especially in the Christian West, Lewis suggested, is the intuition that love is good and hatred bad, or that helping is good and harming bad. But Lewis continues, you cannot go from this intuition to a moral act until the intuition is qualified in some way. He writes, quote, you cannot do simply good to simply man. You must do this or that good to this or that man. And if you do this good, then you can at the same time do that good. And if you do it to these men, you cannot also do it to these men. End quote. So this reminds us of the dilemma above, in which one neighbor is wrongly kicking apart another neighbor and refuses to stop. So as stated already, while it is a Christian duty to love both the victim and the victimizer, we obviously cannot love both in precisely the same way in the same instant. Love, or mercy, for one neighbor may manifest in his defense and rescue. Love, even mercy, for the other might manifest in his correction. This is why Christian morality has sometimes been called an ethic without rules. It isn't meant absolutely literally, but rather it's meant to remind us that most often Christian rules, or rules in general, are capacious, and their expression depends on circumstance. So the rule stays the rule, but circumstances might dictate how that rule manifests. I suggested earlier that to love is an absolute mandate. It's an absolute rule. But what does to love mean in a given situation? To answer that, not only do you need to know what love actually is before you act, you need to have an appreciation for the circumstances that are at hand, and then you have to reason what love would look like given the present context. For Lewis, that the condemnation, punishment, and possible killing of an enemy can be an act of love could only be understood by remembering that as Christians, we believe the human soul is eternal. Therefore, Lewis wrote, what really matters is those little marks and twists on the central inside part of the soul, which are to turn it in the long run into a heavenly or a hellish creature. In this, Lewis is fully aligned with both the just war and the chivalric traditions. Each come from the Thomistic hinterlands, Thomas Aquinas, in which it is asserted that though unchecked wrongdoing may well lead to the happiness of sinners, it is a false, macabre parody of happiness, because it doesn't orient us toward that for which we were made to be. Therefore, when restraining a wrongdoer by forcing him to stop, by deterring him from resuming, and ideally, by provoking him to think again and to change his aggressive ways, we work toward the promotion of the only possibility for his true flourishing. This belongs to his own good, even if it should cost him his very life. In the Hebraic mind, this is the only way to be happy. However jarring all that might be to current sensibilities, Lewis assures us that this is what is meant in the Bible by loving our enemy, wishing his good, not feeling fond of him, nor saying he is nice when he is not. Now, of course, love is at work in our disposition toward these hard tasks, and Lewis rightly insists, quote, even while we kill, we must try to feel about the enemy as we feel about ourselves, to wish he were not bad, to hope that he may, in this world or another, be cured, in fact, to wish his good. This, too, is what we used to call love. So this sentiment is precisely what Augustine asserts in his letter Contra Faustum. Like Lewis, Augustine insists that the just warrior loves his enemy when he avoids a desire for harming, the cruelty of avenging, when he avoids an unruling and implacable animosity, when he avoids the rage of rebellion, the lust to dominate, and the like. Or as Augustine tells the Roman military tribunal Boniface, the just warrior loves when he cherishes the spirit of the peacemaker and recognizes that it is necessity and not happy desire which prompts the conscientious warrior to slay the enemy who fights against him. So for Augustine, as he writes to yet another tribune, the use of violence is deployed against an enemy in order to punish him for his unjust aggressions with a sort of kind harshness. And this kind harshness is meant to constrain him, to prevent him from doing further wrongdoing, to confront him with his own injustices, and through this to encourage him to repent and to embrace peace. Now, of course, contra Augustine and Lewis, to the question whether war can be an act of love, others will say no, and this is not just the pacifists. The military ethicist Martin Cook discusses just war spirituality, and he posits that it's quite unlikely in the midst of combat to actually maintain the kinds of attitudes and psychological ideals that Christian just war writers hold out as the moral ideal for the Christian soldier. And in support of this, Cook points to history. He insists that few conflicts have ever even approximated the normal standards that are found in the just war tradition. In every war in recorded history, he points out, we see conduct that is antithetical to the Augustinian prescription, whether atrocities against the surrendered, the violation of rules of engagement, the inability of war fighters in preventing their attitudes toward the enemy, including enemy civilians, from devolving into contempt and even hatred. We see that throughout history. So this brings to mind another book that I commend to you by combat veteran Karl Marlantes called What It Is Like to Go to War. It's his memoir of his combat experience in Vietnam. And he starts the volume with this. He says, the violence of combat assaults psyches, confuses ethics, and tests souls. This is not only a result of the violence suffered, it is also a result of the violence inflicted. Now, illustrating this, Marlantes recounts a fierce firefight that he led up a steep hill that was laced with interconnected fighting positions. So as he describes it, you could reach, if you were standing straight up, you could reach your hand out and touch dirt. It was that steep. And they have to go up this, and he was partnered with another Marine. And as they're trying to assault this hill, grenades kept bouncing down and detonating. And happily, so far, they were detonating well behind them. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the Vietnamese got their timing right and killed them. So his partner puts down suppressing fire. Marlantes manages to flank the hole. There were two Vietnamese originally in the hole. One ends up being killed right away, but they're pinned down. So Marlantes has a clear opportunity to raise his rifle, and he's looking over the iron sights when the soldier pops back up, grenade in hand. All right. Marlantes describes, in this instant, they lock eyes over the iron sights of his M16. And what does Marlantes do? He pauses, he hesitates, and he wishes for a moment that the boy would drop the grenade, toss up his hands, and he wouldn't have to kill him. He said, but instead, the boy snarls, draws his arm back, and throws the grenade. Marlantes fires, kills the boy. The grenade detonates harmlessly. Marlantes is saved, right? And he asks now, if you ask me then how I feel, I would tell you, great, no more grenades, that's good. He says, another obstacle in the way of completing our mission, resolved, that's wonderful. He said, I would also say something about the joy of doing in the enemy. He said, but if you ask me now, how do I feel? You know, if I'm not too drunk to answer, I will tell you about the grief and the misery and the evils in which I participated. He said, I think of this soldier who was just a boy, he says. And he says, and I realize now that he was then no older than my kids are now. Right? So this means that he's never been married, right? He's never been a father. He's never going to enjoy life with another woman. Instead, he's in this crummy little hole, knowing, as these big Americans come charging up it, that he is in all likelihood about to die. Right? He says, what I feel now, in a word, is empathy. But if I felt empathy then, and this is to Martin Cook's challenge, he said, if I felt empathy then, I wouldn't have been able to kill him. That would likely have cost me my life and the life of my Marines. All right, so this puts paid to this challenge of the Augustinian ideal, the chivalric ideal, is impractical in actual combat. But I've challenged Marlantes. He and I met once, and I challenged him that I didn't quite believe his testimony. He says, if I felt empathy then, I wouldn't have been able to kill him. But what did I say he did by his own testimony when he locked eyes with that boy over the iron sights of his M16? What did he do? What's that? He hesitated. Right now, what is that? Right? What is this hesitating in the midst of combat? Well, he tells us what it was. He says, I hoped that he would drop the grenade and throw up his arms and I wouldn't have to kill him. Right? He felt empathy for that boy. In this interval of hesitation, which can be described as this luminous moment in the midst of raw, red, flesh-hewn conflict, Marlantes encountered the neighbor in his enemy, and then he killed him. So the night, Lewis insisted, this marbling together of what in fallen humanity are those contrasting dispositions, greatness and goodness, justice and love, that are found in the conjunction of Mars and Venus, is, as Lewis put it, the one hope in the world. Such a union, Lewis insisted, does not come easy in the best of times, and unless optimum days, the task is all but impossible. The sentiments that are found in Botticelli's masterpiece are present there only, I would insist, because it is a product of a culture that still acknowledged its Greco-Roman and Hebraic inheritance, an inheritance persistently disclaimed in our own day. We no longer believe in those foundations in which our best beliefs are anchored, and as we abandon ourselves, the just war unity of Venus and Mars is increasingly divorced by those who would dismiss the insertion of love into power politics as weak sentimentality, or, more prevalently, by those who regard the combative side of man's nature as a pure atavistic evil. Those same tawdry alternatives of either brutality or softness were present in Lewis's day as well. They were insufficient then, they are insufficient now. As Lewis warned, the ideal embodied in Lancelot is the only possible escape from a world divided between wolves who do not understand and sheep who cannot defend the things that make life desirable. In a world such as our own, Lewis's closing comments in his reflection on the necessity of chivalry is ominous. There was, to be sure, he wrote, a rumor in the last century that wolves would gradually become extinct by some natural selection, but this seems to have been exaggerated. Thank you.
I'm going to pass the microphone around, and please state your name and your major or degree program when you ask a question.
Turn the lights up so we can get good pictures of you.
Hi, I'm Gavin Kreiner, and my major is pre-law. So during your presentation, I think one question kind of was brewing in my mind that, you know, we're talking about our neighbors, right, and trying to love them, right, but one of the things that kind of sprung up in my mind was, you know, treating neighbors how you want to be treated, and like, I don't know if that's kind of conflicting with kind of what you spoke about, but that was just kind of something that was brewing in my mind when I was listening to it.
Yeah, great question. So I think there's two ways to answer that. Treat others as you want to be treated. What kind of person are you? Are you somebody who wants to get away with doing those things that in the long run will ruin your soul and destroy in you a desire or a taste for heaven? right? And heaven I define as being in the presence of the holy, right? There are certain things that we can do. Habits, moral habits, are habit forming, right? And as Lewis said, they either orient us toward or away from becoming that kind of person that wants to spend eternity in the presence of the holy God. So if you're the kind of person who would really prefer not to be in his presence, then this idea of treating your enemy as you want to treat yourself falls apart, because I want to get away with things, right? I want to do whatever it is that I want to do, whatever it is that makes me happy. So that formula is silly. If you're the kind of person who ultimately, in your best moments, wants to orient toward becoming that kind of person that wants to be in the presence of a holy God for eternity, then you will recognize that in my moments where I am falling away from being that kind of person, where I am sinning, where I am doing evil things, where instead of other-centered acts of self-donation, I indulge in self-centered acts of other donation, right, which is the opposite of love. When I do those things, I want to be stopped, because ultimately I don't want to become the kind of person who habituates away from wanting to be in the presence of a holy God. If you're that kind of person, then it begins to make sense. By restraining my enemy from doing evil, I acknowledge that the person most affected by evil, at the end of the day, is the evildoer, right? So then it begins to make sense, but I think only in such a formula. Good. There's one in the back behind you.
Sir, my name is John, and it is for chaplaincy. And I have a quick question. You mentioned the word prudence along with the word meekness. And I just want to ask if I'm understanding you correctly with the story you told about the soldier in Vietnam, that in that moment where he paused, that he was being meek or prudent. And that's kind of what the connection I'm making. So my question would be, where does prudence fit on the battlefield?
Yeah, good. Prudent fits on the battlefield a number of places. I think the one that seems immediately relevant there has to do with how moral rules work. And it would be nice to believe that moral rules are simple, right? But I think moral rules become complicated because very often in life, one moral rule clashes with another, right? You can see it in more benign situations like surgery, where we always have a moral duty not to harm another. And in isolation, that rule can be followed. Don't go around looking for occasions to harm each other. But the surgeon or the dentist or the parent who needs to correct a wayward child or the just warrior finds an occasion in which the duty not to harm comes into conflict with another duty, maybe to rescue, different things like this, right? And so in this moment where you have two or more goods that are in conflict with one another, and by pursuing this good, I can't equally pursue that good. By pursuing, this rule, I can't meet the requirements of this rule. What do I do? And so in those moments, we need prudence, which is wisdom, to help us determine which rule to follow. And this isn't, one rule overruling another rule. It's just to say that in this world, rules conflict. And how they manifest in complex situations requires wisdom. So, incredibly difficult.
In your answers, you keep talking about prudence, about the values and loving. How then, it was previously mentioned the very foremost of your talk that you have other talks about justifying the bombings of Hiroshima under just war.
Yep.
How is it that the virtue of carrying something out against a civilian population, right? Because it's not a munitions factory.
All right. It's not exclusively a munitions factory, but
some kind of really harsh penalty of being burned alive by radiation.
Yeah.
Or burning them alive with napalm, as it was in Tokyo, or other ones.
Right.
How would that at all be put in the just war context?
Right. Great question. The first answer is by the book. The second answer, which is more substantive for now, is that this is exactly what I'm talking about, because you're absolutely right. In isolation, the question, should we drop a bomb on a city that includes, and you could even say mostly involves innocent civilians, is that the right thing to do? The answer would be no. But there's all sorts of ways to go about this. One is this, that, there's in Thomistic thinking, a statement can be true or false. You could say, so in isolation, a statement is either true or false. It has no middle. It's one or the other. That's it. But when you take one true statement and you bring it into context with another true statement, then it might be the fact that one of those statements is more true than the other true statement. All of a sudden you have grades. One thing might be more noble than another noble thing when they're compared. One good thing might be more good than another good thing when compared. So with something like Hiroshima, what I have to establish is that the good of not dropping a bomb on a city full of innocent people is overruled by other goods that are in conflict with it. Because it's also good, for instance, in this context, to rescue the Chinese who are dying under Japanese occupation every day. And from January 1945 onward, it was about 8,000 Chinese a day, which totals about 250,000 a month, right? So you begin to realize, when you know the context, that there's all these clusters of innocent people stretched throughout the South Pacific. And because of the circumstances at the time, circumstances that we could not entirely control, certain of those innocent people, those clusters, were going to die. And certain of those clusters of innocent people were going to be rescued. And through a long historic-based argument, I come out with the assertion that we had reason to prefer certain clusters of innocent people over this cluster of innocent people. If we could have it that all of them survive, great. That wasn't to be had, through no fault of our own. So we had to begin to choose, and this is where prudence, as ghastly as it is, comes into play, because you have to begin making distinctions between one cluster of innocent people and another when not all of them can be saved. And history determines that, and reason, and all the rest. Ask me later, you've got a follow-up, so I'll hang around while you come and beat me up.
Hi, my name is Jesse Hughes. I'm a pre-law major. My question was, looking at Lewis broadly, I know about a lot of the stuff that he wrote and some of the things that he did. He had a knack for being able to take historic and timeless principles and apply them to current situations.
Yes, he did.
If you look at your Christianity, there's a lot of allusions to the Second World War and the bombings of London.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, how much of Lewis's cultural context played into his understanding of just war theory, not only with the Second World War, but which arguably had a good versus evil component, but also have the context of the First World War, which is arguably a lot more shady in terms of, or a lot more gray in terms of who was right and wrong.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think his biography is not separable from his philosophy and from his writings, right? As you say, he's constantly reflecting back. One of the things I love about Lewis is the theory always has to play out in practice. And he's always looking for historic anecdotes to try to figure these things out. So yeah, if you read his letters, he's always reflecting on his military service, on the prospect that even within an ambiguous circumstance, we can be responsible for how we behave within it. So it's a big question in just war thinking, can you fight an unjust war justly? And I say, well, yes, you can. And others will insist, well, no, you can't, by definition. It's like, well, it's more complicated than that. And so Lewis, I think, is always intersecting his biography with his theology. I think his biography helped produce the kind of person he was. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think you see it throughout his letters.
Hey, my name is Colin. I'm a politics and policy major. And in light of Turkey and Lockean philosophy, what would we do when we have to commit a just war against our own nation state? And what are the implications of that in a Christian perspective?
Talking about like rebellion or revolution?
Well, yeah, but in a modern era, let me put it in the modern era, when there's so much at stake, like citizens and stuff like that, how would you, in a Christian perspective, how would you put that in the modern era?
So just to make sure I'm tracking, what does revolution look like in a modern era from a just war perspective? Yeah, good question. But I think it looks largely like it would look back then, just in some sense, maybe there's more at stake because we have the capacity to destroy and to kill many more things. But within one stream of just war thought, obviously the sovereign is supreme in this, well, not supreme. The sovereign is paramount in determining when wars can be fought. But if you've got a sovereign, so a sovereign is not simply a position, or I'm sorry, say it this way, sovereignty is not defined merely by having the position. Sovereignty is a kind of responsibility. Right? I had said somewhere in the talk that a sovereign is he or she or it or they over whom there is no one greater charged with the care of the political community. So if a sovereign is not caring for the political community, and if that's extensive and grave enough, then that sovereign is unsovereigned themselves. A king can unking themselves. And then it shouldn't be, ideally, up to the mob to determine this and to overthrow that king, but it should be incumbent upon sort of the next tier of leadership. So in Thomas Aquinas, it was lesser magistrates should come together and determine that the king is unking themselves and they need to be overthrown. It should never be left to the mob. Thomas Aquinas was terribly concerned that any society would devolve into simply mob justice. So it would be incumbent upon sort of the next layer. And so you sort of see, the spirit is the same. You've got a sovereign. When they've unsovereign themselves, you go to the next level of sovereignty. And maybe you can begin pressing that all the way down to where you have something like a popular revolt. But he would be really cautious all the way through. I think there are occasions where, I talk about order, justice, and therefore peace. And there's all sorts of places throughout history that we've had order, but we haven't had a lot of justice, and therefore we haven't had a lot of peace. So you think of Saddam's Iraq or Tito's Yugoslavia, right? You had a lot of order. You didn't have a lot of justice necessarily. But we've also learned that in this world, because of the conditions of this world, order without justice is sometimes better than anarchy, right? So you think Syria, you think places like this. So lots of caution, but I think the just war principles still hold firm.
We're running out of time, so we'll take 2 more questions.
There's a couple over.
We have one over here.
Great,
but
you're in charge. I'm not dictating.
Hi, my name is Taylor Nelson. I will be on over here, and I was just wondering how the concept of mutually assured destruction plays into this war.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. With difficulty is the answer. So mutually assured destruction, everybody knows what this is, right? I've got a lot of bombs. You've got a lot of bombs. If you throw your bombs at me, I'm going to throw my bombs at you. We'll all die. And therefore, because we know this, we won't throw bombs. It's a big question in just war thinking as to whether or not you can ever threaten to do what you ought never to do. Some say yes, some say no. It's probably a matter of prudence. So it's an ongoing question. And it's an ongoing question in today's world. This is one place where the modern world, I think, has legitimately outsped the past, in that I don't think anybody believes that America is going to drop a nuke on a city ever again. Now, circumstances will change, and that presumption might shift. So now MAD plays no role in just war thinking. Like there's not a legitimate nuclear ethicist who thinks city bombing as a means of deterrence is credible anymore, because everybody knows we're not going to do it. So now we have tactical nukes and we have other low-yield munitions that are more believable that we would use. They're still ghastly, but now they're not value-focused. They target military installations and things like this, and it's more believable that we would use those things, even though there is still a little bit of a nuclear taboo. So it plays no role now, played a role then. It was always shaky. Everybody's uncomfortable with it. We should be. It's a ghastly thing. But it probably prevented the last century from going up in a radiated cloud of horror. I don't know. That's an unsatisfying answer, but all I got.
Sorry, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your lecture. My question is, how did postmodernism impact, I did Rockwell Funds Hall. I'm an MA in Biblical Studies major. My question is, how did postmodernism impact C.S. Lewis's view of just war?
Oh, I have absolutely no idea. How did postmodernism? Yeah, I'm sorry, I have no idea. Do you have any idea?
I think I might need to write a paper first.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
Sure, sorry. I could waffle and BS my way through that, but I won't, out of love for you.
Marc, thank you so much for joining us today. Please welcome him.